Okay, picture this: you're walking into a city with floating gardens, massive stone temples, clean streets, and a population bigger than most cities in Europe at the time. And it's not fiction, this place was real. It was called Tenochtitlan. And within just 2 years of the Spanish arriving, it was completely destroyed. Not collapsed, not taken over, obliterated. And here's the wild part. It wasn't just guns or swords that brought it down. It was betrayal, broken alliances, a virus the Aztecs didn't even know existed, and decisions that would change history forever. Most people hear Aztecs and think of human sacrifice or gold. But there's a much bigger, deeper, and honestly tragic story behind it all. And it's way more intense than your high school textbooks ever told you. In this video, we're breaking it all down. The rise, the downfall, the myths, the real reason the Aztec Empire vanished in 1521. And I promise, once you hear the full story, you'll never look at history the same way again. Let's get into it. Alright, before we dive into conquests and betrayals, we need to understand who the Aztecs actually were. Because trust me, the empire that fell in 1521 wasn't just some random village with spears and temples. This was one of the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations in the Americas. The Aztecs, who actually called themselves the Mexica, came from a long line of nomadic tribes. Around the 13th century, they finally settled on a group of swampy islands in the middle of Lake Texcoco in central Mexico. Sounds like a terrible place to build a city, right? But that's where the genius starts. They looked around and said, let's build a city on the lake, not beside it. On it. And they did. They built Tenochtitlan, a city that would eventually rival and even outshine major European capitals like Paris and Venice. Imagine causeways stretching across the water, canals crisscrossing neighborhoods like streets in Amsterdam, and floating gardens called chinampas, producing enough crops to feed hundreds of thousands of people year-round. All of this in the 1400s. By the early 1500s, Tenochtitlan had around 200,000 to 300,000 residents, which, for context, made it larger than London at the time. The city was immaculately organized with marketplaces, schools, courts, temples, and public sanitation. Yeah, you heard that right. They had working sanitation. In fact, Spanish chroniclers were shook when they saw how clean and efficient the city was. And you've got to remember, this is long before things like plumbing were common in Europe. Now, what made the Aztec Empire powerful wasn't just infrastructure. It was how they ran their world. They had a tribute system that stretched across what is now central and southern Mexico. Dozens of smaller city-states paid the Aztec capital in goods, services, and even human captives. Yep, we'll get to that part later. They were also militaristic and highly religious. Warriors held high status. Conquering others wasn't just about land, it was part of a cosmic mission. They believed the sun needed nourishment in the form of human blood to keep rising each day. That's where the infamous ritual sacrifice comes in. It wasn't mindless violence. It was spiritual survival. The year's 1519. On the eastern shores of what we now call Mexico, a group of strange bearded men step off their ships in heavy armor, armed with steel swords, horses, and a mindset that everything in their path is theirs for the taking. Their leader? A Spanish nobleman turned conquistador named Hernan Cortes. This guy wasn't some government-assigned explorer. He basically went rogue. He disobeyed orders and set off to find the source of some very juicy rumors. An empire inland, dripping in gold and power. But let's get one thing straight. Cortes didn't just stumble into success with bravery and luck. He knew exactly what he was doing. The Aztecs weren't the only people living in Mesoamerica at the time. In fact, they had plenty of enemies. For years, the Aztec Empire had been expanding by force. They conquered neighboring cities and demanded tribute crops, textiles, jade, feathers, and yes, even people for sacrifice. Not everyone loved living under Aztec rule. And courts? He saw that division and he weaponized it. Within weeks of landing, he made alliances with indigenous groups who were sick of the Aztecs. The Totonacs were the first to flip. Then came the Tlaxcalans, the Aztecs' bitterest rivals. At first, they actually fought courts, but after realizing his value, they joined him. So now, you've got this Spanish force of maybe 400 to 500 men, and suddenly they're being backed by thousands of local warriors who knew the land, the people, and the politics. That's when things got really interesting. Oh, and we can't talk about this part of the story without mentioning La Malinche, also known as Malintzin. She was a Nahua woman who had been enslaved by the Maya, then given to the Spaniards as part of a tribute deal. She spoke both Maya and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and quickly became Cortes' translator, advisor, and strategist. She was the key to every negotiation, every alliance, every psychological play Cortes made. Some historians call her a traitor. Others call her a survivor and the mother of modern Mexico. Either way, she was absolutely critical. So by the time Cortes started marching inland toward Tenochtitlan, he wasn't some isolated invader. He was the head of a growing army of indigenous allies, an anti-Aztec coalition, basically. And Moctezuma, the Aztec Emperor? He was watching all of this unfold, and the worst part? He didn't know what to do. So, here's where things really start to pick up speed. With a few hundred Spaniards and thousands of indigenous allies behind him, Cortes begins marching toward the Jewel of the Valley, Tenochtitlan. But this wasn't just a military march. It was political, psychological, and tactical all at once. First stop, Tlaxcala. Now these guys were the ultimate Aztec haters. For years, they'd been resisting Aztec domination, holding out while others surrendered. So at first, when Cortes showed up, the Tlaxcalans fought him hard. But Cortes held his own. And more importantly, he didn't come to conquer them. He came to negotiate. He convinced them that if they teamed up, they could bring down their common enemy. And boom, alliance sealed. Suddenly, Cortes has a real army. Thousands of seasoned warriors who knew how the Aztecs fought, how they thought, and how to hit them where it hurt. But even with numbers on his side, this wasn't just about muscle. Cortes also knew how to play the long game, and a big part of that was his secret weapon, La Malinche. She wasn't just translating language, she was translating culture. She could help Cortes understand Aztec diplomacy, religion, and nuance. When ambassadors came, she knew which words would sway them. When threats arose, she knew how to flip them into opportunities. Together, Cortes and Malinche became a two-person political machine, manipulating regional tensions, flipping smaller kingdoms, and building a network of uneasy but committed allies as they approached the capital. Now, here's where it gets even more surreal. Along the way, messengers from Tenochtitlan were watching, reporting back. And the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma, he kept hearing conflicting stories. That these Spaniards were gods, that they had fire weapons, that they rode beasts horses were completely unknown in the Americas, that lightning came from their hands, that they couldn't be killed. And then there was the prophecy. Some people believed that Cortes might be the return of Quetzalcoatl, a long-lost feathered serpent god who, according to legend, would return from the east to reclaim his kingdom. Now, did Moctezuma truly believe that? Or was he just hedging his bets, hoping diplomacy could delay disaster? We'll never know for sure. But what we do know is this. In November 1519, Hernan Cortes and his army, Spanish, Tlaxcalan, and Totonac, finally arrived at the edge of the mighty city, and instead of being stopped, they were invited in. What happens next? That's where the story takes a sharp, irreversible turn. So here we are. It's November 8th, 1519. Hernan, Cortes and his growing army have finally reached the edge of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, sitting like a jewel in the middle of Lake Texcoco. But what happens next? Not an ambush. Not a war cry. Moctezuma welcomes them in. I know, it sounds insane, but it actually happened. Moctezuma personally came out to meet Cortes on one of the city's long stone causeways. They greeted each other with gifts, flowery language, and even necklaces of precious stones and gold. It wasn't just diplomacy, it was theater. Symbolic gestures meant to assert power, respect, and maybe uncertainty. But here's the kicker. Cortes was in awe. This city was unlike anything the Spaniards had ever seen. The canals flowed like Venetian streets. The markets were packed with tens of thousands of traders, selling everything from exotic birds and cacao to obsidian knives and ceremonial jewelry. There were zoos, schools, aqueducts, temples that scraped the clouds. Spanish chroniclers wrote about Tenochtitlan like they were describing Atlantis. Even Bernal Diaz, one of Cortes' own men, admitted, "We were amazed," on account of the great towers and quays and buildings rising from the water. It was like the enchantments in a tale. And yet, despite all the gold, the splendor, the gifts, something felt off. Cortes didn't fully trust Moctezuma. And Moctezuma? He definitely didn't trust Cortes. See, Moctezuma was playing a long game. He didn't attack because he wasn't sure what Cortes really was, a man, a god, or a threat too big to face head-on. And Cortes, he played polite, observing, asking questions, counting warriors, measuring the flow of tribute, and slowly, quietly, planning. Then, not long after their arrival, the Spanish pulled a bold move. They took Moctezuma hostage. Yep, they put the emperor under house arrest inside his own palace. The logic? If Moctezuma was under their control, then the empire wouldn't dare fight back. It was a gamble. And for a while, it worked. The city kept running. The people kept paying tribute. But the tension was electric, like everyone knew something was coming. A fragile calm hung over Tenochtitlan, the kind of silence you only hear right before a storm rips the sky open. And that storm? It arrived sooner than anyone expected. Up to this point, things in Tenochtitlan had been tense, but controlled. Cortes had Moctezuma under lock and key. The Spanish were still walking around the city. And somehow, the empire kept running, as if this awkward power dynamic could last forever. But it couldn't, and it didn't. In May of 1520, Cortes got word that Spanish reinforcements, led by a guy named Panfilo de Narvaez, had landed on the coast to arrest him for disobeying orders. So, Cortes left the city with a chunk of his army to go deal with it, leaving Pedro de Alvarado, one of his most brutal captains, in charge. And this is where it all fell apart. During Cortes' absence, the Aztecs were preparing for one of their most sacred festivals, Tenochtitlan, a celebration in honor of the god Huitzilopochtli. Picture this: music, dance, ornate costumes, hundreds of nobles gathering in the ceremonial heart of the city. Alvarado saw this gathering and freaked out. Maybe he thought it was a cover for an uprising. Maybe he just couldn't understand how deeply spiritual and non-military this ritual was. Either way, he did the unthinkable. He ordered a massacre. Spanish soldiers blocked the exits to the temple and slaughtered hundreds of unarmed Aztec nobles and priests. They were dancing, singing, wearing their finest regalia, and they were cut down with swords, spears, and musket fire. Blood ran down the steps of the temple. Everything exploded after the massacre. The Aztecs weren't afraid anymore. They were furious. They surrounded the palace where the Spaniards were holed up, cut off their supplies, turned the city into a trap. Courts tried to calm things down. He even brought Moctezuma onto the balcony to speak to his people, hoping his words would restore order. But the crowd didn't listen. They threw stones, slings, and spears. And Moctezuma, emperor of an empire, ruler of millions, was hit in the head and died not long after. Some sources say the Aztecs killed him. Others claim the Spanish did it when they realized he was no longer useful. Either way, Moctezuma was gone. And with him, the last thread holding the piece together. The Spanish were trapped, surrounded by canals, bridges, and warriors who knew every inch of the city better than they ever could. Courts knew they had to escape, and he picked the dead of night to do it. June 30th, 1520. The Spaniards loaded up all the gold they could carry, bars, jewelry, sacred objects, and tried to sneak out along the narrow causeways. But the Aztecs were ready. As the Spaniards moved silently through the darkness, war cries erupted from the shadows. Canoes appeared from the water. Warriors poured in from every direction. The causeways became slaughter zones. Horses drowned in the canals. Soldiers slipped, fell into the water, and were dragged under. Many were weighed down by the gold they were trying to smuggle out. The survivors would later say that the lake turned red with blood. This night would go down in history as La Noche Triste, the sad night. So after La Noche Triste, you'd think the Aztecs had won, right? They had pushed out the invaders. Moctezuma was gone, yes, but a new leader, Cuitlahuac, was rising. The empire was bruised, but still standing. But just as they started to rebuild and organize a defense, something else arrived. Something far more deadly than Spanish steel: smallpox. Here's what happened. One of the Spanish soldiers from Narvaez's crew, the same guy's courts fought off on the coast, brought smallpox with him. He didn't survive long, but the disease did. The Aztecs had no immunity. This was a virus they had never encountered before. No antibodies, no chance. And it spread like wildfire through markets, temples, boats, villages. Entire families died within days. Priests, farmers, soldiers, scribes, gone. And worst of all, Cuitlahuac, the new emperor who had rallied the people after Montezuma's fall. He caught it and died. The leadership was decimated. The military command chain in chaos, morale collapsing. And the thing about smallpox wasn't just how fast it killed. It was how it made people suffer. Reports describe people covered in sores, blinded, choking in pain, with no one to care for them because their entire households were infected. In just a few months, up to half of the population of Tenochtitlan was dead. Half. It's hard to wrap your head around that. Imagine trying to fight off an enemy while your entire city is literally dying around you from something you can't even see. And the Spaniards? They didn't even realize they had brought it. They couldn't have planned it, but it turned out to be the most powerful weapon they ever unleashed. When courts returned to regroup, what he saw was different. The once great capital was weakened, grieving, scattered. The warriors were fewer. The people were starving. The empire's immune system, literally and politically, was broken. And courts knew what that meant. The final siege was coming. By early 1521, Hernan Cortes was no longer the desperate guy fleeing in the night. He was on a mission, and this time, he came back with everything he needed to finish what he started. He had new ships, more weapons, thousands more indigenous allies. And his target? The shattered but still standing capital of the Aztec world, Tenochtitlan. But Cortes wasn't dumb. He knew he couldn't just charge in again, not after what happened during La Noche Triste. So he changed the plan. This time, he would siege the city. starve it, cut it off, bleed it out. First, he built 13 brigantines, small warships, right on Lake Texcoco. These weren't fancy galleons. They were brutal lake machines, designed to give the Spanish full control of the waterways. Remember, Tenochtitlan was basically a floating city. Water access was life. Once Cortes launched the ships, he started cutting off the city's food supply. He blocked the causeways, burned bridges, destroyed aqueducts. Every canal, every entry point shut down. And inside the city, famine, disease, desperation. The people were literally drinking from ditches, boiling leather to eat. For 93 straight days, the city held out. Aztec warriors fought in the streets, on rooftops, in canoes, tooth and nail. But every day, the Spanish moved further in, house by house, district by district. And here's something wild. Cortes didn't do it alone. He had tens of thousands of indigenous soldiers at his side, Tlaxcalans and others who had been enemies of the Aztecs for years. Some wanted revenge, some wanted freedom, but they all wanted the Aztec regime gone. By August, Tenochtitlan was unrecognizable. The temples were smoking ruins. Bodies floated in the canals. The air reeked of rot and burning stone. And yet, the Aztecs kept fighting. Their final emperor, Cuauhtémoc, led from the front lines. Young, determined, and fearless, he refused to give up. But on August 13, 1521, as he tried to escape across the lake in a canoe, Spanish brigantines cut him off. He was captured, brought to Cortes, and when asked to surrender the city, Cuauhtémoc simply said, "I have done all that I could. Now take this dagger and kill me." Cortes refused, but the empire was over. After nearly 3 months of siege and 3 years since the Spanish first arrived, the once great capital of the Aztec world was gone. With Cuauhtémoc's capture, it wasn't just a leader who fell, it was the soul of an empire. The last emperor was young, fierce, and unbroken in spirit. He fought with everything he had to protect his people, his city, and his heritage. But his surrender marked the official end of Aztec independence. Cortes, standing victorious, marched through the shattered streets of Tenochtitlan, a city that only decades earlier had been the shining jewel of Mesoamerica. But now, it was a ghost town. The temples were smashed or turned into Christian churches. The markets were empty. The grand palaces reduced to rubble. Spanish conquerors imposed their culture, religion, and governance. The Aztec way of life, rich with tradition, spirituality, and knowledge, was systematically dismantled. Yet, even in defeat, the legacy of the Aztecs survived in language, art, and the bloodlines of millions. Their story didn't vanish, it transformed. And centuries later, their descendants still walk the lands they once ruled. So, when you think about the fall of the Aztec Empire, remember, it wasn't just a military conquest. It was a tragic collision of worlds, driven by ambition, misunderstanding, and forces beyond control, like disease. The Aztec Empire's fall reshaped history forever. And it all started with that city on the Lake Tenochtitlan, where dreams, power, and tragedy intertwined. So, why does the story of the Aztecs still matter? Because it's not just ancient history locked away in dusty books. The Aztecs shaped the very land we now call Mexico, its culture, its language, its spirit. Think about this. The Nahuatl language, spoken by the Aztecs, is still alive today, used by over 1.5 million people. Their art and symbolism inspire modern design, tattoos, and architecture. Their complex calendar system influenced our understanding of time. And beyond culture, their story teaches us about resilience, about what happens when worlds collide, when power is challenged, and how the human spirit endures. The Aztec Empire reminds us that history isn't just about winners and losers. It's about people, lives, and legacies. So next time you see a skyline, hear a story, or taste traditional Mexican food, remember, you're connected to a legacy that survived conquest, tragedy, and time. The Aztecs may have fallen, but their spirit, it's very much alive. And that's why their story is worth remembering.